Marcus Wellington had everything money could buy. His sprawling mansion overlooked the Mediterranean Sea, his garage housed 12 luxury cars, and his bank account held more zeros than most people could count. As the CEO of Wellington Industries, a multinational corporation dealing in technology and real estate, Marcus commanded respect wherever he went. At least, he thought he did. On a crisp autumn morning in Monaco, Marcus stepped out of his custom Rolls-Royce Phantom outside the Prince's Palace. He was there for an exclusive business meeting with several European dignitaries about a massive development project. The meeting could potentially add another billion to his already vast fortune. Marcus straightened his Italian silk tie and walked toward the palace entrance, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the cobblestones. The palace guards stood at attention in their pristine uniforms, their ceremonial weapons gleaming in the morning sun. These weren't ordinary security guards. They were members of the elite Carabiniers du Prince, hand-picked men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family. Each guard had undergone years of rigorous training, not just in combat and security protocols, but in diplomatic etiquette and international relations. Among them stood Captain Henri Dubois, a man in his early 30s, with steel-gray eyes and an unwavering sense of duty. Henri had served the royal family for 8 years, ever since he graduated from the military academy with highest honors. His father had been a palace guard before him, and his grandfather had served the previous prince. For Henri, this wasn't just a job. It was a sacred trust passed down through generations. As Marcus approached the main entrance, he expected the guards to step aside immediately. After all, he was Marcus Wellington. CEOs of major corporations, prime ministers, and celebrities all knew his name. In his mind, these guards should recognize his importance and show the proper deference. But as he strode forward expecting a clear path, Captain Dubois remained firmly in position. "Sir, please present your identification and invitation," Henri said in perfect English, his voice professional but firm. Marcus stopped abruptly, his face flushing with indignation. In all his years of wealth and power, he had grown accustomed to doors opening before he even approached them. Security personnel at airports, hotels, and exclusive clubs all knew to expedite his passage. The idea that this guard, this employee in his mind, would dare to delay him was incomprehensible. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "I'm Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Industries. I'm here for a meeting with the Minister of Economic Development." Henry checked his clipboard methodically, his expression unchanged. "Sir, I need to see your invitation and a form of identification. These are standard security protocols that apply to everyone." The word everyone struck Marcus like a physical blow. He wasn't everyone. He was special. He was important. He was wealthy beyond measure, and wealth meant power, and power meant exemption from the petty rules that governed ordinary people, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't carry identification like some common tourist," Marcus sneered. "My assistant handles all that paperwork. Just call someone inside, and they'll vouch for me." Henry remained professional but unmoved. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but I cannot allow entry without proper documentation. If you'd like to contact your assistant or the party you're meeting with, there's a telephone booth just outside the palace grounds." The suggestion that he, Marcus Wellington, should walk to a public telephone booth was the final insult. In his twisted logic, this guard was deliberately humiliating him, probably because he was an American businessman in a European palace. Or perhaps the guard was simply too stupid to recognize obvious importance when he saw it. Marcus stepped closer to Henri, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Listen carefully, you insignificant little man. I own buildings taller than this palace. I employ more people than this entire principality. I could buy and sell you 1,000 times over. Now step aside before I have you fired." Henri's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his professional demeanor held. "Sir, I'm going to ask you once more to provide identification or contact your party. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises." The word disruptive sent Marcus over the edge. In his corporate world, he was used to intimidating subordinates, crushing competitors, and getting his way through sheer force of wealth and personality. This guard's calm resistance to his authority felt like a personal attack on everything Marcus believed about his place in the world. Without warning, Marcus raised his hand and struck Henri across the face with his open palm. The slap echoed off the palace walls like a gunshot. The other guards immediately moved toward the commotion, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons, but Henri held up a restraining hand to stop them. "I am a representative of the Sovereign Prince of Monaco," Henri said quietly, his cheek reddening from the blow but his voice steady as granite. "You have just committed an act of aggression against an official of a sovereign nation." Marcus realized immediately that he had made a terrible mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "So what? Sue me. I'll pay whatever fine you want. Money solves everything." Henri stepped back and spoke into his radio in rapid French. Within seconds, additional guards appeared from seemingly nowhere, surrounding Marcus. But these weren't just palace guards. Among them were plainclothes, security officers, and what appeared to be government officials. "Mr. Wellington," said a new voice. A distinguished man in an expensive suit approached, flanked by two serious-looking individuals. "I am Inspector Laurent Moreau with Monaco's State Security. You are under arrest for assault on a government official and conduct likely to disturb the peace of the principality." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the palace walls. "This is ridiculous. I barely touched him. I'll have my lawyers here within the hour, and this will all disappear." Inspector Moreau exchanged glances with Henri, then looked back at Marcus with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Wellington, I don't think you understand the gravity of what you've done. Captain Dubois isn't just a security guard. He's a commissioned officer in the service of Prince Albert II. By striking him while he was performing his official duties, you've committed a crime against the state itself." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus was already planning his next moves. He would call his team of high-powered attorneys. He would leverage his political connections. He would write a check large enough to make this embarrassing incident disappear. After all, he had bought his way out of problems before: labor disputes, environmental violations, even a few personal scandals that could have ruined lesser men. But as they led him away from the palace, past the tourists and photographers who were already snapping pictures and recording videos, Marcus failed to notice the small crowd that had gathered. He didn't see the faces of the other palace guards, men who had watched one of their own be humiliated and assaulted. He didn't notice the tight-lipped expression on Inspector Moreau's face, or the way Henri Dubois stood a little straighter despite the red mark on his cheek. Most importantly, Marcus didn't understand that he had just crossed a line that separated his world of corporate power and financial influence from a realm where different rules applied, rules that had been established centuries before his fortune existed and would continue long after his money was forgotten. As the police car pulled away from the palace, Marcus stared out the window at the Mediterranean Sea, still convinced that this was merely an inconvenience that money would soon resolve. He had no idea that he had just triggered a sequence of events that would strip away everything he thought made him powerful and teach him lessons that no amount of wealth could have prepared him for. The palace guards resumed their positions, but the atmosphere had changed. Word of the incident was already spreading through the tight-knit community of palace staff, security personnel, and government officials. Captain Henri Dubois touched the red mark on his cheek once, then stood at attention, ready to continue his duties. But something had been set in motion that went far beyond a simple assault charge. In the luxurious police station where Marcus was being processed, he was already on his phone with his legal team, barking orders and demanding immediate action. He had no idea that across the city, other phone calls were being made, calls that would soon show him the difference between having money and having true power, between commanding fear and earning respect, between buying compliance and deserving dignity. The holding cell at the Monaco police station was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined he would experience. The walls were clean but stark, furnished with only a metal bench and a small sink. For a man accustomed to boardrooms with mahogany tables and offices with panoramic views, the 8-by-10 foot space felt suffocating. But Marcus wasn't worried. Not yet. He had faced corporate crises before, hostile takeovers, SEC investigations. Money had always been his solution, and he had plenty of it. His first call went to Thomas Brennan, the senior partner at Brennan, Cox & Associates, the most expensive law firm in New York. Thomas had gotten Marcus out of trouble before, including a particularly nasty lawsuit from former employees and a regulatory investigation that could have cost him millions. "Thomas, I need you on a plane to Monaco immediately," Marcus said when the call connected. "I've been arrested on some trumped-up charges. It's nothing serious, just a misunderstanding with local security." There was a pause on the other end. "Marcus, what exactly happened?" "I had a minor altercation with a palace guard. The man was disrespectful, so I slapped him. Now they're treating it like I committed treason." Thomas Brennan had been practicing international law for 25 years. His voice took on a careful professional tone. "Marcus, you need to understand something. Monaco isn't the United States. It's a sovereign principality with its own laws and customs. If you struck an official while he was performing his duties—" "I don't care about their customs," Marcus interrupted. "I care about getting out of here. Bring whoever you need to bring. Pay whatever you need to pay. I want this resolved by tomorrow." After hanging up, Marcus felt better. Thomas would handle everything. He always did. Money opened doors that seemed permanently locked to other people. Marcus had learned this lesson early in his business career when a well-placed donation to a politician's campaign fund had suddenly made a zoning issue disappear. Since then, he had perfected the art of strategic financial influence. But as the hours passed in the cell, Marcus began to realize that something was different about this situation. When Thomas arrived the next morning, his usually confident demeanor seemed strained. "Marcus, we need to talk," Thomas said, settling into the chair across from him in the consultation room. "I've been meeting with local officials all morning, and this situation is more complicated than you realize." "How complicated can it be?" "I'll pay a fine, issue an apology, and we'll move on." Thomas shook his head. "It's not that simple. Captain Henri Dubois isn't just a security guard. He's a commissioned officer in the Carabiniers du Prince, which makes him an official representative of the sovereign. When you struck him, you committed what they consider an act of aggression against the state itself." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Then we pay the state. Every government has a price." "That's exactly the wrong attitude," Thomas said sharply. "Prince Albert II has built Monaco's reputation on transparency and rule of law. They don't negotiate with wealthy individuals who think they can buy their way out of crimes." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt a flicker of genuine concern. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your usual approach won't work here. The prosecutor is talking about formal charges that could result in significant jail time and deportation. But there's something else you need to know." Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a news article. The headline read, "American CEO Assaults Monaco Palace Guard." Below it was a photo of Marcus being led away in handcuffs, and another of Captain Dubois with the red mark still visible on his cheek. "This story has gone viral," Thomas continued. "It's been picked up by international news outlets. Social media is calling you the entitled American CEO, and worse, your company's stock price dropped 8% yesterday alone." Marcus stared at the phone screen in disbelief. In the photo, He looked exactly like what he hated most, a spoiled, arrogant, rich man who thought his money made him better than everyone else, which, if he was being honest with himself, was exactly what he had become. "We can handle bad publicity," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Can you? Because your board of directors held an emergency meeting this morning. They're discussing your future with the company." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Wellington Industries was his life's work. Built from a small real estate firm, his father had left him into a global corporation. He had sacrificed everything for that company: marriages, friendships, relationships with his children. The thought that his own board might turn against him was inconceivable. "They can't remove me. I own 43% of the company." "But you need board approval for major decisions, and your recent behavior has made some members nervous. The assault charge is just the latest in a pattern they're calling increasingly erratic behavior." Marcus tried to remember what other incidents they might be referring to, but realized with growing horror that there had been many. The time he had screamed at a waiter in front of other executives because his steak was overcooked. The board meeting where he had humiliated a junior executive for asking a reasonable question. The charity gala where he had made crude remarks about the event organizer's wife. At the time, these incidents had seemed like minor expressions of his authority and personality. Now he was beginning to see them as something else entirely, a pattern of behavior that revealed the ugly person he had become. "There's more," Thomas continued. "Captain Dubois has declined your offer of financial compensation." "What offer? I haven't made any offer." "I took the liberty of approaching him through official channels, suggesting that you might be willing to make a substantial donation to a charity of his choice in lieu of formal prosecution. I thought it might demonstrate remorse and good faith." "And?" "He said that his honor and the honor of his uniform weren't for sale at any price. He wants to proceed with formal charges and a public trial." Marcus sat back in his chair, truly stunned for the first time. In his world, everyone had a price: politicians, competitors, regulators. They all eventually accepted some form of financial incentive to make problems disappear. The idea that someone would refuse money on principle seemed as foreign to him as refusing oxygen. "What kind of man turns down money?" Marcus asked, almost to himself. "The kind of man you assaulted," Thomas replied quietly. "Marcus, I've done some research on Captain Dubois. He comes from a military family with a long tradition of service. His grandfather died defending Monte Carlo during World War II. His father received a Medal of Honor for stopping an assassination attempt on the previous prince. This isn't about money for him. It's about honor, duty, and respect." Over the next several days, as Marcus remained in custody awaiting formal charges, the situation continued to deteriorate. News outlets around the world picked up the story, each adding new details that made Marcus look worse. Someone had leaked the recording of his initial conversation with Henry, where his entitled attitude was on full display. Another report detailed his history of treating service workers poorly, including testimony from former employees about his abusive management style. Wellington Industries' stock continued to fall as major clients began to distance themselves from the company. A hotel chain canceled a billion-dollar development contract, citing concerns about the company's leadership. An environmental group that had been considering partnering with Wellington Industries on a sustainability initiative pulled out, saying they couldn't work with someone who showed such disrespect for others. Most painful of all, Marcus's own children released a public statement distancing themselves from his actions. His daughter Sarah, whom he hadn't spoken to in 3 years after a disagreement over her career choices, said in an interview that she was deeply ashamed of her father's behavior. His son Michael, who worked for a competitor, simply said he was not surprised by the incident. As Thomas worked frantically to negotiate some kind of plea arrangement, Marcus found himself with nothing to do but think. In the quiet of his cell, Away from the constant demands of business and the endless stream of people who told him what he wanted to hear, he began to replay not just the incident with Henri, but the entire trajectory of his life. He remembered the young man he had been when he first took over his father's small real estate company. He had been hungry then, but not arrogant. He had worked 18-hour days and treated his employees like family. He had been proud, but not entitled, confident, but not cruel. When had that changed? When had he started believing that his wealth made him fundamentally different from other people? When had he stopped seeing service workers as human beings deserving of respect and started viewing them as obstacles to be pushed aside or tools to be used? The answers came slowly, painfully. It had been gradual, like a slow poison. Each success had inflated his ego a little more. Each million in the bank had convinced him that he was special, chosen, above the common rules of human decency. He had surrounded himself with people who fed his arrogance, assistants who anticipated his every need, executives who laughed at his bad jokes, consultants who told him he was a genius even when he made obviously poor decisions. On his 5th night in custody, a guard brought him a visitor. Not Thomas, not any of his remaining allies, but Father Michael Rodriguez, the chaplain who ministered to prisoners. Marcus had never been particularly religious, viewing faith as something for people who couldn't solve their own problems. "I didn't ask for a priest," Marcus said. "Captain Dubois did," Father Rodriguez replied, settling into the chair across from him. "He asked me to visit you." "Why would he do that?" "Perhaps because he recognizes that you're suffering even if you don't recognize it yourself." Marcus laughed bitterly. "I'm suffering because I'm stuck in jail for barely touching an overzealous security guard." Father Rodriguez studied him for a long moment. "Is that really what you think happened?" For the first time since the incident, Marcus found himself unable to give his standard response. Under the priest's steady gaze, the comfortable lie he had been telling himself began to crumble. He hadn't barely touched Henri Dubois. He had humiliated a good man who was simply doing his job. He had used his perceived status and wealth as weapons to attack someone who couldn't fight back. "He was just doing his job," Marcus said quietly, the admission feeling like a confession. Yes, he was. And doing it well, with dignity and professionalism. Even after you struck him, he showed restraint and followed proper procedures. That's the kind of man he is. "Then why did he ask you to visit me?" "Because Captain Dubois believes that every person has the capacity for redemption, even those who have lost their way. He sees you not as an enemy to be punished, but as a human being who has forgotten how to be human." That night, alone in his cell, Marcus cried for the first time in 20 years. The courtroom in Monaco was smaller than Marcus had expected, but its dignity was unmistakable. Dark wood paneling, formal portraits of previous princes, and an atmosphere of serious purpose filled the space. As Marcus sat beside Thomas, wearing a simple gray suit instead of his usual custom-tailored attire, he felt smaller than he had in decades. Judge Marie-Claire Beaumont presided over the proceedings with quiet authority. She was a woman in her 50s who had built her reputation on fairness and an unwillingness to be influenced by wealth or status. As she read the charges against Marcus, assault on a public official, disturbing the peace, and conduct prejudicial to public order, her voice carried the weight of centuries of legal tradition. Captain Henri Dubois sat in the witness section, still in his dress uniform but without the ceremonial elements he had worn at the palace. When called to testify, he walked to the stand with the same measured dignity Marcus remembered from their first encounter. "Captain Dubois," the prosecutor began, "please describe the events of October 15th. Henri's testimony was precise and professional. He recounted the encounter without emotion or embellishment, sticking strictly to the facts. When asked about the moment Marcus struck him, he simply said, The defendant slapped me across the face after I requested proper identification according to standard security protocols. How did you feel when Mr. Wellington struck you? The prosecutor asked. Henry considered the question carefully. I felt surprised that someone would resort to violence over such a routine request, but my primary concern was maintaining the security of the palace and following proper procedures. When Thomas cross-examined Henri, he tried to suggest that the incident was minor, that no real harm had been done. But Henri's quiet responses undermined every attempt to minimize what had happened. Captain Dubois, isn't it true that this was a very brief encounter that lasted only a few minutes? Yes, sir. But in those few minutes, Mr. Wellington chose to use physical violence against an official performing his lawful duties. And you weren't seriously injured? Physical injury isn't the only consideration, sir. There's also the question of respect for the law and the institutions that protect society. As Marcus listened to Henri's testimony, he was struck by something he hadn't noticed during their original encounter. Henri never spoke with bitterness or anger. He answered each question thoughtfully, treating even Thomas's attempts to diminish his experience with courtesy. This man, whom Marcus had dismissed as an insignificant obstacle, possessed a dignity that Marcus realized he himself had lost long ago. When it came time for Marcus to testify in his own defense, Thomas had advised him to express remorse while maintaining that the incident was blown out of proportion. But as Marcus sat in the witness chair, looking out at the courtroom filled with reporters and observers, he found himself unable to stick to the script. Mr. Wellington, his own lawyer began, can you tell the court what led to this unfortunate misunderstanding? Marcus looked at Henri, who was watching him with the same calm attention he had shown that morning at the palace. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Marcus said quietly. I knew exactly what I was doing. Thomas shot him a warning look, but Marcus continued. Captain Dubois was doing his job professionally and courteously. I became angry because I expected special treatment based on my wealth. When he treated me like everyone else, I felt insulted, so I hit him. A murmur ran through the courtroom. This wasn't what anyone had expected from a man fighting serious charges. Mr. Wellington, Judge Beaumont said, are you saying you struck Captain Dubois deliberately? Yes, Your Honor, and I was wrong to do it. The judge studied him for a long moment. Continue. Marcus took a deep breath. For the first time in his adult life, he told the complete truth about himself. He talked about how his wealth had gradually corrupted his sense of humanity. He described the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment, the way he had treated employees, service workers, anyone he perceived as beneath his status. He admitted that he had come to Monaco that day believing that his money made him special, entitled to different treatment than ordinary people. I've spent the last 2 weeks in custody thinking about who I've become, Marcus said. I've realized that somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing other people as human beings. I started seeing them as obstacles or tools. Captain Dubois was just doing his job, treating me with the same professionalism he shows everyone. I struck him because I couldn't accept that my money didn't make me better than him. When Marcus finished testifying, the courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, absorbed by this unexpected display of honesty from a man they had expected to maintain his arrogance to the end. During the recess, Thomas was furious. What are you doing? That testimony could result in the maximum sentence. Maybe that's what I deserve, Marcus replied. Since when do you care about what you deserve? You've never cared about consequences before. Marcus looked at his lawyer, a man who had helped him evade accountability for years. That's the problem, Thomas. I've never faced real consequences. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't have become the kind of person who hits people for doing their jobs. When court reconvened for sentencing, Judge Beaumont addressed Marcus directly. Mr. Wellington, your testimony today was remarkable, though I'm not sure it was wise from a legal standpoint. Your honesty about your motivations and behavior has been noted. However, the court must consider not just your remorse, but the seriousness of the offense and the need to maintain respect for public officials. She sentenced Marcus to 6 months in prison, a substantial fine, and 3 years of probation. But she also offered an alternative. If Marcus would agree to perform 2,000 hours of community service in Monaco, working with organizations that serve the underprivileged, his sentence would be reduced to time served plus the probation period. However, she added, this community service must be performed personally, without delegation to assistants or representatives. You will work directly with people in need, under supervision, for the full duration. Marcus accepted immediately. As he was led from the courtroom, he caught Henri's eye. The captain nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement of justice and forgiveness. The next 18 months transformed Marcus's life in ways he could never have imagined. His first assignment was at a homeless shelter in Monaco Ville, where he served meals and cleaned facilities alongside other volunteers. Initially, his presence attracted media attention, but as weeks passed and he continued showing up without fanfare, the cameras moved on to other stories. Working at the shelter, Marcus met Jean-Pierre, a former construction worker who had lost his job and home after a workplace injury. Jean-Pierre treated Marcus with the same wariness he had once shown service workers, not with hostility, but with the careful distance of someone who had learned not to trust wealthy people's motives. "Why are you really here?" Jean-Pierre asked one evening as they stacked chairs after dinner service. "Because I need to learn how to be a decent human being again," Marcus replied honestly. Over time, Jean-Pierre and others at the shelter began to share their stories. Marcus learned about the thin line between security and poverty, about the dignity that people maintained even when they had lost everything material. He discovered that many of the homeless individuals he served had more honor and integrity than he had shown during his years of wealth and power. His second assignment was at a youth center in one of Monaco's less affluent areas, where he helped teenagers with job training and life skills. Many of these young people reminded him of his own children, whom he had neglected in pursuit of ever greater wealth. Through working with them, he began to understand the damage his obsession with money had done to his own family relationships. Meanwhile, Wellington Industries struggled without his direct involvement. The board had installed an interim CEO, but Marcus's reputation continued to damage the company's prospects. Major contracts were canceled, stock prices remained low, and several key executives left for competitors. The empire he had built was crumbling, and for the first time, Marcus found that he didn't care as much as he thought he would. One day, while working at a food bank, Marcus encountered Captain Henri Dubois, who was volunteering during his off-duty hours. The two men worked side by side for several hours, sorting donations and preparing packages for families in need. When they finally spoke, it was Henri who broke the silence. "How are you finding the work?" Henri asked. "Harder than running a corporation," Marcus replied, and meant it. "But more important." "Why?" Marcus considered the question while folding clothes for distribution. "When I ran my company, I was always focused on abstract numbers, profit margins, stock prices, growth percentages. Here, everything is immediate and real. When I help someone get a meal or find a job, I can see the actual impact. I'd forgotten what that felt like." Henri nodded. "That's why I became a guard. I wanted work that mattered." "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said in court," Marcus continued. "I've had time to research your background, to learn about your family's service to Monaco. I understand now that when I struck you, I wasn't just hitting a security guard. I was attacking everything you and your family represent: duty, honor, service to others. I'm ashamed of who I was that day." Henri stopped his work and looked at Marcus directly. "The man who struck me couldn't have said those words. That person was lost in his own importance. But people can change if they're willing to do the work." "Have I changed enough?" That's not for me to judge. But I will say this. The Marcus Wellington, who couldn't accept being treated like everyone else, would never have spent 18 months serving others without cameras or publicity. That suggests the change is real. As his community service neared completion, Marcus faced a choice about his future. Wellington Industries was still salvageable, but it would require him to return to the corporate world that had corrupted him originally. Several board members had approached him about resuming his role as CEO, arguing that the company needed his leadership to recover. Alternatively, he could walk away from the business entirely, using his remaining wealth to support the organizations where he had been volunteering. It would mean giving up the empire he had spent decades building, but it would allow him to continue the work that had begun to restore his sense of purpose. On his final day of community service, Marcus returned to the palace where everything had begun. Captain Henri Dubois met him at the same entrance where their confrontation had occurred. This time, Marcus presented his identification without being asked, waited patiently while Henri verified it, and thanked him courteously for his service. "So what happens now?" Henri asked, as they stood where Marcus had struck him 2 years earlier. "I'm not sure," Marcus admitted. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm choosing what matters over what pays the most." "That sounds like wisdom." Marcus looked at the palace, then back at Henri. "I spent most of my life believing that money could solve any problem, that wealth made me special. You taught me something money can't buy." "What's that?" "Self-respect. The real kind, not the artificial confidence that comes from a bank balance. I can't undo what I did to you, but I can make sure the person who struck you is gone forever." 6 months later, Marcus Wellington announced that he was stepping down permanently as CEO of Wellington Industries. He sold his controlling interest in the company and used the proceeds to establish the Dignity Foundation, an organization focused on supporting working people and their families. His first major initiative was a partnership with Monaco's Palace Guard Association to provide educational scholarships for children of service members. Captain Henri Dubois attended the foundation's launch ceremony, not as the victim of Marcus's assault, but as an honored guest, recognizing a man's journey back to humanity. When the two men shook hands that day, they did so as equals, not in wealth or status, but in the measure that mattered most, their shared commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect. Marcus never became poor in the financial sense. His remaining wealth was still substantial, more than enough for a comfortable life. But he had learned the difference between having money and being ruled by it, between commanding fear and earning respect, between buying compliance and deserving trust. The man who had once believed money could fix anything had discovered that the most important things in life, honor, dignity, and genuine human connection, could never be purchased at any price. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the incident that changed his life, he would tell them about the palace guard who couldn't be bought, the community service that taught him what service really meant, and the hardest lesson he ever learned, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact one person can have on the lives of others.